So, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce a return guest to the Live, Love, Learn podcast today for a really incredibly important discussion about a subject that couldn't be more relevant to every single person watching this. So, today we're joined by Dane Wigington. And for those of you that don't know Dane, let me just tell you a little bit about him. Dane is the lead researcher and administrator for the website geoengineeringwatch.org and is executive producer for the groundbreaking climate engineering documentary, The Dimming. All of this will be linked below, so please do go and check that out. Dane has a background in solar energy and has devoted over 20 years of his life to constant research on the issue of covert global climate engineering operations and the effort to expose and halt them. Dane's appeared in numerous films and interviews in his effort to educate the public on the extremely dire environmental and health dangers we face from the ongoing climate intervention operations. So, Dane, it's so lovely to see you here. I always wish we could sort of meet to discuss something, well, we will be covering some positive things as well. But first and foremost, how are you doing? Because your work is very much ongoing, isn't it?
It is. And the gravity and immediacy of what we collectively face is accelerating rapidly. And this is what we are trying so desperately to wake people up to, Catherine. And the conditions here in Northern California are becoming hellish. And the formerly thriving lush forests of Northern California are dying, drying, and I fear soon will again be incinerating. Wildlife populations plummeting. The fish populations in the rivers here are compromised and in many cases dying. Algae blooms are happening now because the waters are superheating. The UV is off the scale. This is from a damaged ozone layer, which climate engineering is the core causal factor not being admitted to. So again, whatever other causes and concerns people are focusing on, if we don't deal with this, nothing else will matter. Everything else will be moot soon.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And for those people, obviously, we have a whole range in the audience, Dane. We've got some people that are really familiar with the concept and know a lot about geoengineering. And we've got other people that are still very, very new to this and don't really understand the difference between geoengineering, chemtrails that, gets floated about on social media and debunked as a conspiracy theory, and also the general climate change. And I was sharing with you before we started recording that I live in the middle of the countryside. And honestly, when we spoke last year, a year ago, the deterioration in where I live now to the number of geoengineering flights we're seeing on a daily basis. But what's really hit home, Dane, is this year I've got rescue horses, all my friends have got horses, and there's no insects around this year. I mean, when I was a child and we used to drive back at night, unfortunately, you'd have splattered insects all over your headlights, all over your car window. And even people that aren't aware of what's going on and causing this have been commenting to me in the UK this year, like, where are all the insects? There's no flies bothering the horses. My garden's empty of insects. So this just shows what a huge deterioration we've had over the last year. But for people that are new to it, what's the correct terminology that we should be using to describe this phenomenon, and what exactly is it?
Climate engineering is a good overall general term. It's very clear. Some of the other science terms are geoengineering, stratospheric aerosol injection, and cloud albedo enhancement. There's other terms, but climate engineering encompasses all of that. It's a very clear term. I want to make this clear also that the publicized, quote, weather modification localized operations are not this. This is very different. And those operations, which are generally a single engine propeller driven aircraft with a few flares on the wings, those programs are simply meant to distract people into thinking that this is something small scale and benign, which it is not. We're talking about, instead of what people perceive as weather modification, again, a plane that might drop a few kilos of materials through the flares on the wings, a KC-135 military tanker can carry 100 tons of toxic nanoparticle elements to be dispersed into the skies in a single payload. We've extrapolated from rain testing in the US over a single US state what is likely being distributed globally, and it's somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 million tons of nanoparticles distributed into our skies all of which are settling to the surface, all of which we get to breathe. This is very bioavailable, very bioaccumulative. In the case of the insects, Catherine, we have peer-reviewed study. Your listeners can search bees, aluminum. We have peer-reviewed study to prove the bees, and it's not just the bees, but we have studies on the bees, are dying of symptoms that resemble Alzheimer's and dementia in a human being. They can't even find their way back to the hive because they're so packed full of aluminum. How is this not alarming? How is this not a headline everywhere? Because the same people behind climate engineering control media. And they are simply, in the US, they're entertaining nonstop with political circus. You have to see it to believe it. It's absolutely absurd and virtually meaningless, but people are caught up in it while we're hurtling toward near-term planetary omnicide. And that's not my opinion. It's not conjecture or theory. It's a statistical mathematical fact. And near term doesn't mean centuries. It doesn't mean decades. It means the front door is being kicked in right now. When the insect population crashes, plankton populations are crashing, UV's bombarding the surface, crops aren't growing, empty food shelves are coming. We are all in a very perilous place right now.
Yeah, I know. It really is that serious. Now, for a lot of people, I think there's so much confusion about climate engineering and climate change. And because you've touched on the political situation and it's the same sort of all over the globe, great distraction to keep people from talking about the real issues. But so many people are climate deniers now because the narratives that are being pushed are linking things like 15-minute cities, taking away people's transport rights, digital currencies with the climate change agenda. And this is causing huge waves of people to say there's no problem at all, to go to the other extreme, whereas we know both things can be true. So what's your way when you explain to people about how the climate engineering sits with the climate change agenda?
I would start with first, at least for the moment, pushing all the other controller agendas out of the picture. Because when that's used as a basis to decide the reality in front of their face, that's not the right basis for that. Just because those in power have agendas and objectives doesn't change a specific reality. And I challenge people to look around the planet and see what's happening. You have whole countries descending into chaos because there's literally not enough to eat. For those that know what's happening in Haiti, it's starting to happen in about 36 plus countries around the world. Absolute chaos, carnage. Haiti is a failed state. It's literally a Mad Max reality, and there's dozens of other countries directly behind it because there's not enough to eat. So I think in the UK, you guys have had a fair amount of damp and moisture for parts of this year, and for many people, whatever's outside their doorstep seems to dictate their perception of the entire planet.
Yeah.
And that's wrong. We're talking about a small location that can be manipulated in a specific way, populations that are more important because their countries are more powerful. They keep that population dumbed down by keeping the climate in a specific state that does not indicate what's happening around the world. So again, I challenge people to look past their immediate horizon, what's happening in India, China, failed crops everywhere. It's either flash drought, flash flood, flash freeze. Catherine, have you seen the constant massive hail that's falling here in the US? I mean, it's constant. We have baseball and softball size hailstones obliterating crops and cars and solar fields. And that's indicative of chemical ice nucleation. So what's happening is when there's enough moisture, they're chemically nucleating that, and that causes this massive hail, but it also causes a surface cool down, shallow layer of surface cold on the ground because this is heavy, dense air. But in between that, the temperatures go right back through the roof. And I mean through the roof. It doesn't cool down at night. And when you have that kind of thermal energy buildup, it starts to affect virtually everything. And this, we have the toxins on top of that. So in an overall context, what I would encourage people to try to understand is one, if we're going to have any chance of winning this battle, we need to unite the tribes, not divide them. We need to understand that although I am no fan of Al Gore or any of the environmental groups or the green agendas, which aren't green, electric cars aren't green. They're not going to save us from ourselves. They're in many ways much more destructive than a combustion engine, but both are destructive. The overall human industrialized, militarized society scenario is not sustainable. And the bottom line is we've been very bad stewards of the planet. We need to rethink our entire situation. And on top of that, this intentional intervention in the climate system, which is not benevolent, I want to stress that there's nothing benevolent in their attempt to block the sun and mask the severity of what's happening. It's simply an attempt to hide reality from the population for purposes of power and control for as long as possible. So there's nothing benevolent in that. And they're using weather as a weapon, absolutely crushing agricultural regions so that populations are struggling just to make it through every single day. And that makes them much easier to control because they simply can't focus on the wider horizon. They're dealing with daily dilemmas. So there's many layers to this, but I want to stress with populations, we have to focus on the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat first. This intentional manipulation has prevented the planet from responding to the other forms of damage done. So we need to deal with that first, and then we need to focus on the rest. But as far as introducing this issue, I would encourage people to, this is my final point, to stand on this ground, that there's no legitimate discussion about climate anything from any perspective without first and foremost addressing this issue. And that's something we should all agree on.
Completely agree. So well explained. And I think one thing I am encouraged about, I'm very discouraged by seeing the reality of what's happening in nature all around us. And yes, you are so right. That's such a good point that people are very concerned with what's outside their front door. And therefore, that is very easy to control which people rebel when based on what they're exposed to. But one thing I have been pleased to see is so many more people are looking up to the skies and saying, hang on a minute, we did not have clouds like this. This can't possibly just be condensation trails from planes. So there's a lot more discussion about what is going on in our skies. Are you seeing that where you are in America?
Yes, and in the whole condensation trail narrative, again, this is perhaps one of the biggest deceptions ever perpetrated on populations. This is not condensation. We have film footage to prove this. That narrative is so easily dismissed for anyone who's looking through a clear lens. When we have film footage of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible, turning on and off, that's the end of the debate. This is not condensation. And the severity of what's happening, and I want to put this into context because people have been trained to believe that somehow the planet will always be fine. It has some kind of magic thermostat that keeps it habitable. That's absolutely untrue. We're hurtling towards what, based on all scientific data, it's called the cloud's tipping point, where we have done so much damage to the atmosphere, to the ozone layer, and we have so radically altered atmospheric chemistry that it is now already radically interfering with the planet's cloud producing processes. And we see far fewer white, puffy cumulus clouds. Northern California, what we see mostly now is aerosol filth in our skies. And if the planet's cloud producing capabilities wane to the point where the heating goes completely exponential, we're done. We're absolutely done. You can't completely alter atmospheric chemistry without a very bad result. And that's where I want to stress again, this equation is this and that equation. It's climate engineering, and it's got to try to get our arms around this, that we're putting 100 million barrels of hydrocarbon into the air a day, 100 million barrels, 26 million tons of coal a day. That's altering atmospheric chemistry. And Catherine, you've heard people say CO2 is great. The more the better, right? Plant food, the more the better. Well, put your plant in a bucket full of water, underwater, and see how long it lives that way. Not very long. Again, there's a balance that needs to be maintained. And when you've altered that balance from all these directions, again, climate engineering as well, and the whole ozone layer situation, blaming that on hairspray cans, again, that's a red herring. That's a distraction. Climate engineering is the core destroying factor, but not the only factor. So people are trained to think in this or that. You're either on the blue team or the white team. You're either Democrat or Republican. Or the world is not so simple, is it? So we need to understand it's a complex equation, but at the same time, focus on the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat. And we cannot hide from what they're dispersing in our skies. We're breathing it. It's toxifying everything, our soils, our waters. It's destroying the planet's protective layers, starting with the ozone layer. If we don't deal with that, it's game over in the extremely near term. I can't stress that enough. And once they can't hide this from the population, and the population wakes up to what's been done to them, what will the power structure do then? Will they disperse something? They already have the dispersion mechanism. Will they disperse a pathogen that's much more lethal at that point and level the playing field? Why wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think this is such good points. Um, in terms of what people are actually seeing and what they can do about it, well, actually, let me take it back a bit. So I know we did cover, and I will link our first interview below. We covered this a bit, but it's such an important point for people to understand. I'd like to go over it again if we can, Dane. About the thing that gets thrown back most to me at the moment is don't be so silly because they're poisoning themselves as well if they're really doing this. So how do you address that as a denial mechanism?
That's a very good point, and that is the premise on which so many people decide to keep their eyes wide shut and pretend they're not seeing what they're seeing.
Mm.
And again, as I pointed out so many times, how much have they, and that they are those who print the money. I want to make that clear. People wonder who they are. Is it this political party or that? No, all that's a facade. All that's an illusion. It's those who print the money, those who control militaries, thus they control countries, they control media, same core power. They're controlling conflict zones around the world, and
Yeah,
people actually waving their banners in support of the very entities that are spraying them in the skies, that are also controlling the conflict zones, and those entities control the narrative. So they actually are able to garner public support for all their crimes and what they're doing because the public believes the narratives they see on the mainstream media, which couldn't be further from the truth. So about what they are doing to themselves, and I want to stress, we're not dealing with sanity, we're dealing with a form
yeah,
of insanity that, according to psychoanalysis, doesn't comprehend the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. That's an addict. We're talking about power addicts. Do addicts care that their next fix might kill them? They don't. They continue. And these people are not going to let go of power, even if it kills the entire planet in the process. So, for what they've done to themselves already, detonation of 2,400 plus nuclear bombs, that's contaminated everything on planet Earth. They detonated hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere, which scientists thought could collapse the entire atmosphere. Did that stop them? That's Project Starfish Prime. No, they did it anyway. We have a triple nuclear meltdown in Fukushima. No technology to fix it, no end in sight. That by itself will be an extinction level event if other factors don't do the job first, which is the course we're on. Are they not building nuclear plants anymore because we have no technology to fix this? No, they're building 60 more right now. We have 442 online right now, all of which will become Fukushimas as soon as collapse happens and there's no one to man those plants and keep them cool. So again, there's so many forms of insanity of what they have already done to themselves. So when people excuse it with that, that's simply another form of denial. And
yeah.
for those that throw out the conspiracy theory term at this point, Catherine, that term is a badge of dishonor. Anybody who belches out that term, that's simply a sign that they are factless, fearful, and simply want to follow the official narrative.
Completely agree. Thank you so much for addressing that because I think it is really important. And I think, unfortunately, we've got most people are sort of living in a high state of stress with financial issues, with lifestyle issues, with all the mass level of brainwashing that we've been programmed to. You know, that when you start looking at the lies that have been told to keep the populations under the control, you can understand to some extent why some people bury their heads in the sand and just don't want to know. However, we've got to really move forward with this. One of the things that I think people have been noticing is all the fires that we've had over the last few years. Now, again, your research shows about how there's a link to the geoengineering and a lot of the fires that have been happening. Can you talk us through how those are connected?
In the case of the unprecedented wildfires or firestorms, that's a better term perhaps, they can be most directly linked to climate intervention operations. The source of ignition, I want to stress this, the source of ignition, that's a separate subject. There's 100 different ways that can happen. That could be done through intentional arson that may be a part of the power structure scenario and of control as well. But the primary part of this equation is what is setting the template for these forests to burn with such ferocity, and that is climate engineering. So they can cut the precipitation off to vast swaths of forest for as long as they want, drawing them out. When they're dropping these toxic desiccant particles that are killing soil microbiome, killing root systems, that's killing the trees from the bottom up. So you're starting to get forests that are completely riddled with dead trees. When you have a disintegrated ozone layer that's frying the foliage from the top down, now you add these desiccant particles are also incendiaries, Catherine. So you're literally blanketing the entire forest foliage and floor with an incendiary dust. Now, because again, desiccant particles create a lot of atmospheric friction, which creates static buildup, which creates more dry lightning. You have much more dry lightning now. So that's another source of ignition. So the question is, why would they want to facilitate the burning of forests? Because that's another excuse many people use to just look the other way. We have actual U.S. military documents posted at geoengineeringwatch.org. One's 140 pages long, Forest Fires as a Military Weapon, describing exactly the same type of preparation over the course of years before incinerating forests. And we have peer-reviewed science study advocating for the intentional burning of boreal forests, northern and southern latitude, to provide temporary cooling as a form of climate engineering. Because when you fill the sky with smoke, it can stay aloft if the fire burns hot enough for 2 or 3 months. And we saw that happen last year when the Canadian fires all ignited almost simultaneously in parts of eastern Canada. That smoke bank with manipulation of atmospheric pressure zones was pushed down over the US Northeast, where it dropped temperatures 20 to 30 degrees. And that smoke was then pushed down and held on the surface with a dome of high pressure. That's easily accomplished with verifiable science, ionosphere heater like HAARP in Alaska, and there are many more around the globe. When you hit the ionosphere, when you transmit millions of watts of power into the electrically charged ionosphere, it causes an electrical chain reaction. That heats the atmosphere. That pushes the atmosphere up and down. The downward push in the atmosphere is a high pressure heat dome, and that can hold that smoke on the surface for days or weeks or months. So, and we have the Coriolis effect of the planet, which is the rotating of the planet, and that tends to force much of that smoke toward the polar regions, which provides temporary cooling there. But think about the cost of this. So you're going to destroy the planet's last remaining life support systems, and the fact that populations are being exposed to highly toxic smoke, and we know they're spraying on top of these smoke banks. I want to stress that as well. That is such a harbinger of the malevolence of these programs. CNN News in the US just did a big special on the Paradise Fire, which was a major fire here in the US. And we captured, geoengineeringwatch.org captured blanket aerosol spraying on top of the smoke bank. Now, why would they do that? Those are incendiary particles. If they're not trying to make sure that fire burns with ferocity, the hotter it burns, the higher the particles go, the more of a geoengineering effect it has. It's mimicking the temporary cooling effects of a volcanic eruption. And that's how short-sighted they are in these programs. So I'll stop there. It's a complex subject, but I encourage your listeners to search this title, one of our most important reports, Wildfires Serve Geoengineering Agenda. Shocking data in that report.
Brilliant. I'll link that below for everyone. So I really hope you're enjoying this podcast as much as I am. And I just wanted to take a little break to tell you about the amazing products by the sponsor of this podcast, the biophotonic EMF and bioresonance devices, which help us take our healing to the next frequency. So let me start with the bioresonance devices. Biophotonic have two amazing little devices, the little BioNexus and the biophotonic, and both of these are really the next generation in bioresonance devices. So let's start with the little BioNexus. This amazing little device literally sits in the palm of your hand, And it's now my go-to support, especially when doing my daily manifestations and affirmation practices. But it will balance out my frequency to work on whatever needs balancing for me right here, right now. So what are some of the benefits of this little bio-nexus? Improved energy, decreased inflammation, supports our immune system, psychological homeostasis. But also it supports the integrity of the cells, improves our memory, cognitive, emotional, and psychological states, and speeds up recovery. And just like we've been talking about today, it really improves human consciousness support. Now, the other bioresonance device, the biophotonic, absolutely amazing little device, comes preloaded with a range of therapies. And this will clear parasites, giving active protection. You can wear it with you. It comes in a little pouch that you can wear around your neck, and it detoxifies heavy metals, clears EMF radiation out of cells, cleanses bacteria and viruses, detoxes chemicals and toxins, DNA repair, pain repair, you name it. And it's even got calming meditation practices that, well, complexes that you can run to strengthen the aura field, and frequency packs can also be added to your water. I think we all know the detrimental effects now of mobile Bluetooth and EMF radiation. They've been extensively studied, and I've done loads of videos on it. So minimizing our exposure is crucial. So what's really key is both the biophotonic and the bionexus. They're standalone, lovely little devices that don't require Bluetooth connection, a Wi-Fi connection. You don't need to buy any frequency packages. There's no subscription fee, and you don't need a mobile phone to control them. There's no electrodes. They're completely wireless, ready to use straight from the box. So you can get these and a full range of EMF protection devices that you can use for yourself and your pets. Don't forget to use coupon code CE20 to get 20% off all products, including the EMF protection. Thank you. And now back to the podcast. So in terms of people that obviously the health aspects of what they're spraying are huge. I mean, you've already mentioned the bee population and the aluminium and the effects that that's sort of mimicking Alzheimer's, etc., dementia type conditions in bees. And I think most people watching this, regardless of their background, will understand how catastrophic it is for all life on Earth. I think we've got to stop talking about humanity in its own and look at all life on Earth, because everything, we're all linked, the ecosystems are all linked.
Yes.
But obviously this is having a devastating, and has been for a long while, on human health. And we know dementia cases have escalated so dramatically over the last decades. How long has this actually been going on, Dane, that we know about?
All available data indicates these programs were initially deployed immediately after World War II.
Wow.
Over the polar regions, and expanded steadily since that point. One primary expansion year was 1998, when that was the warmest year ever recorded up to that point. And what was their response? Double down on what they're doing. That's the military-industrial complex mentality. If what you're doing is causing destruction, you're just not doing enough of it. Do more. And that's how they think. So that's when, in 98, when the term climate change was implemented, because they knew they were going to use more and more of the chemical ice nucleation operations, which causes this weather whiplash flash cool down, literally from record high to record cold. We've had swings here in the U.S. Amarillo, Texas, in years past, there was a May 1st date in Amarillo, Texas, where they went from a record high of 100 degrees to snow in a single day. We just had snow a week and a half, 2 weeks ago in the Pacific Northwest here in the US, snow in late June, while it was pushing 120 degrees or pushing 49, 50 degrees C in other parts of the US not far away. That's clearly not nature. So again, there's been a manipulation the whole way through, and they incorporated the climate change term and then pushed the narrative that this is normal. We should expect these flash cool downs with climate change, and that's total nonsense. Absolute nonsense. That's chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. That's why you have the big hail again, the extreme hail everywhere all over the globe now. So there are so many layers to this scenario that it's imperative for people to have a little bit better understanding of it. Again, our groundbreaking documentary, The Dimming,
Yeah.
which is now, in spite of draconian social media censorship, is over 15 million views now. And that's very respectable under any circumstances, that people do want to know what's happening here. And we are hearing from other circles, Catherine, that politically, you probably saw that Tennessee passed legislation banning geoengineering. And
Amazing.
again, it's a symbolic move. There's no way to enforce it, but it really helped to put it on the radar. And they're trying to hide this as hard as they can. We saw it happen in Dubai. You saw the flooding there.
Yeah.
And they initially admitted that climate engineering operations were involved. And then they immediately tried to backtrack on that and deny that, because that was something that they didn't intend to be announced. And we captured the day before and the day of that event absolutely undeniable frequency transmission signatures on the clouds in the Persian Gulf near Dubai. There's no question this was a climate engineering scenario. So again, the ramifications from interfering with the planet's primary life support systems cannot be overstated. And the contamination is, as you were discussing earlier, with not just aluminum, but barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers, surfactants. Those last two, polymer fibers and surfactants, as we may have discussed before, are used militarily for biological carrier platforms to carry a pathogen from the clouds to the ground. Why is that in our rain? And now we know from peer-reviewed study, we have PFAS, forever chemicals. That's a classification of chemical. There's about 15,000 different PFAS chemicals. It's in every single drop of rain, everywhere, all over the planet. And as of a week ago, we have new peer-reviewed study proving that these PFAS chemicals are readily absorbed through our skin.
Yeah.
So how bad of an equation does that paint? What else? We're not just breathing it, we're absorbing it through our skin. And when you mix all these chemicals together, you get synergistic toxicity. They're all toxic by themselves. Mix them all up, and the toxicity goes exponential. So it's a very bad place we're in, and people need to pay attention, or we're not going to be here much longer.
It really is, and we briefly touched on it last time, but the impact on the animals is even more severe, because obviously you've got the insects, and we mustn't forget about the sea life. So let's just mention a little bit about what's happening to the plankton and how significant that is, because again, we've had this discussion around sea levels going on for ages, and there's so much toing and froing. But the impact of all these contaminants getting into the sea is absolutely catastrophic.
It is. And so with plankton, let's start with that. First, no plankton, no people.
Yeah.
Simple equation. We have peer-reviewed science study now to prove that the plankton populations in the Atlantic, based on measurements in 500 separate locations, have crashed 90%. That's a crash. And the other oceans are not far behind. So with the plankton, it's not just all the contamination. It's not just the superheating seas. And they are superheating. For those that don't know in the UK how hot, Florida ocean temperatures last fall reached 102 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the same temperature that Jacuzzi Hot Tubs recommends for their hot tubs. 102 degrees killed everything, fish, coral, everything. And that thermal energy buildup is profound, because a cubic meter of seawater contains 4,000 times more energy than a cubic meter of air. It can hold much more heat. So when the oceans superheat, the planet's not far behind, which they're trying to mask with climate engineering, which is making it worse overall, not better. But we have the plankton crashing. We have the superheating seas also being contaminated from many sources. I'm not denying all the runoff, toxic everything flowing into storm drains, into the sea, sewage dumped everywhere, cruise ships dumping all their pollution, military ships dumping everything from petroleum pollution to all their septic dumps, trash. Everything goes into the ocean like a giant trash dump. So we're destroying the planet from every conceivable direction. But add the superheating, add the destroyed ozone layer killing plankton, and we're hurtling toward what is known as Canfield Ocean. Your listeners might look that one up. That means a lifeless, superheated, stratified dead zone. Oceans die, we die. Very, very simple. And it is happening by the day. And statistically, with fisheries, global pelagic fish populations, the food fish, down over 90% right now. Not going to be eating fish much longer, not that we should anyway, because all of it, virtually all of it, is contaminated. And people think freshwater fish probably safer. No, not true. We have recent peer-reviewed study of freshwater fish in the US, for example. Hundreds of locations recently tested, and their conclusion, eating one freshwater caught wild fish in the US is equivalent to drinking contaminated water for a month. Think about that. I mean, what do we do when we have nothing to eat that's not contaminated and have nothing to eat at all on the current course? People need to turn off the political theater and the sports games and start focusing on how we survive much longer. It is that bad.
Yeah. I didn't know about the fresh fish, actually. I mean, that is just absolutely shocking. And again, the impact all the way up through the food chain is just tragic. So what can we start to do? Call to action for people. For those people that have known about this and they're well aware, and for those people that this is all new to, what are the steps that we can do as individuals to start turning this round?
We have far too many people that care or claim to care, and as far as they seem to get with helping to move this fight forward is posting an occasional comment on a blog, and that's not enough. And everybody from their own home computer for no cost can share, for example, links to the dimming. That's the
Yeah.
single most comprehensive tool in this fight. And that can be emailed to elected officials, environmental groups. We can have the farming ag groups. I mean, the list is endless. And when emailing that, what's also beneficial is to openly CC a number of other caring citizens so that whoever's receiving that email knows a lot of people realize they're getting that information dropped in their lap, and it helps to keep them accountable. And what we need to do is to reach enough awareness, a critical mass of awareness, so that populations realize this is a near-term fight for life, period. And only then will enough wheels in this battle begin to turn where we can push it to the full light of day. And I don't want to insinuate that if we can fully expose this, that our problems are over. They are not.
No.
We have crashed through the guardrail. This is for those that have seen the Thelma and Louise movie, the famous scene of them in the car sailing through the air toward the bottom of the canyon. And that's the place the human race is in right now. And profoundly, even in that position, the human race wants to fight over what station to put the radio on, and completely unconcerned about their predicament. We need to get past that. So again, we're not helpless. Those in power aren't gods. And if we realize we can start these spot fires of awareness and encourage others to do the same, and in doing so, if we can fully expose this, if we can bring it to the light of day, and those participating, and that's where we have a chance of stopping it, because the vast majority of those participating don't understand they're participating in their own demise. And if we can get them to stand down, at that point, we have a chance of stopping these operations. If we can stop them and allow the planet to respond on its own to the damage done, we could at least buy time. And that's worth fighting for.
It certainly is. So I am going to be making sure, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening to it on the podcast platform, all the notes will be in the description box below with all the links that Dane shared, or in the show notes for the podcast. You all know how to get hold of me. If you can't get hold of the links, let me know. I'll make sure you get them. My call to action is that every single person watching this shares this widely with the links below. Every single family, every single school, every single group of friends should be sitting there within the next week and watching the dimming. And then as you start to educate yourself, as Dane said, we can all be reaching out now. We've all got I think throughout the world, I think this is the year that they've got more elections going on this year than any other year in history across the globe. So now's the perfect time to be sending this out. For us next in the UK, it's next week. So, but we can't sit back and say it's too difficult to handle. We've got to just keep taking action, each and every one of us, and not just leaving it to a few people to be really sharing all this information, because as you say, just sharing something, some post on social media is not enough. We've got to have real action now.
It's not. And they've, again, as we discussed in the beginning of the broadcast, those in power are very effective at dividing populations. And they have done this with the programming they've pumped into the environmental groups, for example. They have programmed those groups and the constituents of those groups that when someone mentions climate engineering, again, they're denying any other form of damage to the planet, and they shut down immediately. And they don't want to hear anything about climate engineering because they feel everything else is being denied. And that's where we need to beat them at their own game by simply stating, no, we recognize we've been very bad stewards, but how can you claim to care about the environment and ignore this most destructive human activity of all? We learn to beat them at their own game and build bridges and stand on that common ground again of no discussion, no legitimate discussion about climate anything can take place without addressing this first. And we need that's the part that in the environmental communities that have been programmed again to knee-jerk react and not address climate engineering because they think it's a denial of everything else. If we realize that, then we can play this game more effectively and simply acknowledge the other damage. But again, we need to focus on climate engineering first. And so we must learn to play effectively, Catherine, because we're running out of time rapidly.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I respect so much about you, Dane, is how respectful you are in terms, despite all the horrendous information you've got at your fingertips, how respectful you remain in your discussions. And I would really call out to everyone sharing that to maintain that, because by throwing insults around, we don't get anywhere. We're just going to
Correct.
put people down. And now's the time where we've got to sort of be the parent in the situation and actually focus on it's not about being right anymore. It's about getting some real action to stop this. And that, as you say, will buy us time to decide what next.
Yes.
Just a final word for you. I mean, you've been working tirelessly in this, Dane, for over 20 years. On a personal level, how do you cope with all of this? Because it's a lot, isn't it?
Thank you for asking. This is another very important part of the equation because as societies, we've been trained to believe if we can't find a magic solution, we should just ignore the problem. And that's completely incorrect. And from a philosophic standpoint, we first must remember what's within our control and what's not, and focus on what is. And again, what is in our control? It's in our control to share credible data from a credible source, to start spot fires of awareness, to raise the level of human consciousness as to what our future will hold if we remain on the current course, not just for us, but our posterity, which will never be on the current course. And I cannot stress that enough. Those who think that somehow the planet will always magically fix itself no matter what we do to it, that is not the case. So philosophically, again, I remember that if we're here for a reason, it's not just a personal pursuit of pleasures until our final breath. We're here to make a difference for the better. Do we not owe our existence to the whole? I would argue we do. And all of us have had bonus time. I've had far too many bonus times in my life, meaning that situations that we faced that could have taken us out of the equation, and somehow we escaped that circumstance. And do we not then owe our lives to the whole? For those of us who have children, the moment we have children, we owe our lives to them. We don't own our lives, we owe it to them. We owe it to the whole. Let's start behaving like that. And the only form of solace I've ever known, Catherine, the only form is fully facing the storm head on, not hiding in my cabin on the Titanic, facing the storm head on. That's where solace lies. And I encourage people to consider that perspective and to know they're not helpless. And if they start circles of awareness around them and that starts to expand and feed on itself, they'll realize how much power they have. And in fact, if we all embark on this journey of 1,000 miles, it begins with a single step, and we all need to take that step.
We certainly do. Thank you so much for your time today, Dane. And more importantly, thank you so much for everything you share with each of us, because your knowledge is absolutely phenomenal. You're putting credible resources out there. So each and every one of us, starting with myself, we've got the information now there. We can educate ourselves. We can get this word out. We can really start to make a difference. And if every single person did that, we could make changes very quickly. Thank you so much, Dane.
Thank you, Catherine. And as a final note on that equation, for those that don't think about the exponential aspect of this. If we all did practice what you just outlined, we would reach a critical mass far faster than anyone would imagine. And we need to, with every fiber of our being, to focus on that. We are rapidly running out of time.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you everyone to watching. And I know it's a very serious subject. Of course it's serious, but serious doesn't mean that we can't make a difference. So let's just collect that energy and sort of put it into something constructive. Thank you, Dane. Thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you so much for taking
Bye.
the time to listen. And if you feel inspired, please do share with your friends and family. This helps us spread the word and also helps me encourage some exciting new guests to take part in this podcast. And above all, stay curious and stay free.